like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. They're gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. They ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like a dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all time.
All right, Stormy Waters, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Doing well, doing well. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, man, I'm happy to have you on. Look, as anyone who listened to this show will know, I do a lot of these, right, 2 a week, and so even despite that, it can be pretty easy to let things slip your mind. And I've been wanting to have you on the show for quite a while now, and have just never made it happen. And I am happy to be fixing that problem. So obviously, I know who you are. You know, I've listened to a few of your appearances and like them quite a bit. But my audience might not be familiar with who you are. So could you just introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. I am a former startup founder, two-time startup founder, and after selling them off to very dumb people, I'm joking. Started investing in a lot of startups because that's just what you do. Because you want to pretend like you're still in the game, and I do that, professionally now. So I run a small VC firm.
So one of the
Mid-size.
things, one of the things that we talked about before was the utility of spaces like ours to, what we referred to as smart money. And in that conversation, you explained sort of the actual utility of unknown information. Do you want to get into that a little bit? Because I thought that was a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, in information asymmetry, would you like me to kind of point it towards like how it applies to kind of the people like me, but much larger, that are orbiting our space, right? Because I find the I guess you could say the way our brains function that works, from an investment standpoint, is also very effective from the political. And so, like, just VCs period, and the same goes for hedge fund managers even more so, right? Private equity a little bit more mellow, but our edge is information asymmetry, right? So like I am going to seek out things that nobody knows, and so I can know them and you can't, right? Or you don't yet. Because when I know something that you don't know, that means I'm about to make a bunch of money off of you because you don't know the thing that I know. And I mean, it's the easiest to explain in the terms of trades, right? So like, let's say if I know a company has this critical flaw, right? Or I know something that this company depends on to exist, right? But it's, second and third order down the supply chain in this whole other industry on maybe this whole other, different continent. I know they're about to have a huge problem. I mean, something is going to blow up. It's going to be terrible, right? And that's going to trickle all the way down through the supply chain. And this regular company that everybody knows about is about to blow up. That means I am going to be trading against you, right? So you don't know the thing that I know, but I do. And my bets aren't going to make any sense to you, right? But they will, when this thing happens. And if everybody knew that information, they would all be doing what I'm trying to do, right? So, like, let's say I'm going to short a stock, or let's say I'm going to go long a stock just for easy, easiness of explanation. I'm going to get in there, and since nobody else knows this thing, right? That stock's going to be super cheap. But if everybody knew the same thing I knew, they would all be doing the same thing as me, right? And then that, if everyone's running to buy a thing, it's no longer cheap, it's expensive, right? That information is priced in, right? That's, you know, when you ever hear the term saying that, someone, you know, an investor saying, oh, that's probably priced in already, or that's, you know, priced in, that means that that information that you think is, you know, unique is actually a lot more widespread than you may believe. And the price differential that would come from that information has already been set, right? That edge that you had has already been realized by others, right? So that over time, or that dynamic, changes the way you look at the world, right? Fundamentally, like, you are actively seeking out information asymmetry. Like, I want to know the things that other people don't know, because inherent in that is the ability to, you know, generate return on capital. And I'm going to seek it out wherever it is. It doesn't have to be anything that has to do with investing, because after a while, you're, you know, kind of like, you know, Pavlovian dog. You're triggered by it. You're just going to, you know, autistically dig and dig and dig because you saw a phenomenon. And phenomenons are what we inherently seek out, right? If I see something that doesn't make any fucking sense, no matter what it is, I need to get to the bottom of that, because that means that my map of the world has a big blind spot in it, right? Like, I think I know how the world works. I think I know all the information at play in the system, right? But in the way I see the system, this thing that's happening should be impossible. That means I don't know everything. That means there is something at work that I'm not seeing, and I know everybody else, you know, thinks the same way I do. So if I know that thing, I'm going to have an edge on everybody else, right? So people that are like professional investors, so when you see guys like Mark Andreessen, Thiel, a lot of the guys that have become recently, you know, very relevant in our thing, people will see things that they may have said 5 or 6 years ago or whatever, and they're going to assume that that is how they still believe, right? Or that is what they still believe, and that is still how they think. But what I struggle to express to people is that that couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like a hedge fund manager, right? So some guy swinging, you know, 10, 50 billion around, right? That guy changes his entire worldview probably once a year, right? Once every couple years, right? He will see the world entirely differently than he saw it, you know, just a couple years ago. There is no ideology at all. We don't believe in it, right? Because ideology is a weakness, right? That is an edge somebody is going to have against you, right? You are not thinking clearly. You are not seeing things as they are, right? So these guys will pick up whole paradigms of thought, right? It's not just like one idea, right? A whole complex of ideas that leads you to see the world the way you see it, right? They will just pick it up, try it on, see how predictive it is, right? Will this paradigm allow me to make accurate predictions of the future? No, it does not. Or it does, except in this. All right, well, then I'm going to keep everything except for anything around this, and I'm going to drop that whole part of my paradigm and build it from scratch. And these men do it again and again and again and again. So saying what these people, you know, believed a couple years ago as somehow, you know, relating to how they see the world today is stupid, right? If that was actually how these people's brains work, they'd be dead already. They'd be out of business, right? Somebody with a more flexible and malleable way of looking at the world would have taken all of their money and laughed as they did it and taken all of their LPs. Right? So when we see these people, they're not fixed at all. If I present Mark Andreessen with a different way of looking at the world, he will pick it up. He will look at it. Right? He will test drive it for a little bit. Right? Because another thing is that these people can hold completely contradictory ideologies or frameworks in their brain at the same time. Right? And A/B test them. Right? If you're not married to any one ideology or any one framework, you can pick up 2 or 3 at a time and be like, oh, well, look at this strange fucking situation. Well, I locked up my bike and now my bike's gone. And there's some fucking black guy with my bike. Wow. That doesn't fit this framework or this framework, but this framework over here explains that. Okay, well, I'm going to pick up this one. And they will do that again and again and again and again and again with every aspect of their life.
So, Stormy, I've got a question, right? I find the argument you're putting forth convincing, but, right,
What?
I find it convincing, right? But let me play devil's advocate for a moment
Please.
here. What would you say about the likes of someone like, Larry Fink, right? This kind of like socially aware investing that it's kind of past its moment, but was very popular for kind of the last like 5 to 6 years.
You would have to assume that social investing was actually the purpose of the investing. All right, there's John Pierpont Morgan said, there's every man does things for 2 reasons. There's the reasons why he tells everyone he's doing them, and then there's the reasons why he's actually doing them. So my question with you, I hate to answer a question with a question because it is rude, but is Larry Fink actually believing those things, or is he telling you that he is believing those things? Because I can make a very convincing argument that he believes none of those things. But in fact, he is in a situation, right? Larry Fink and BlackRock are a elephant on stilts, right? You've got what everyone always talks about this, oh, he's got $14 trillion worth of capital. Like, no, he doesn't. He manages $14 trillion of pension funds, right? But how much capital does he have? Right? How much capital does Blackstone have? Or sorry, BlackRock have? Blackstone's doing just fine. I mean, they may have overextended themselves in commercial real estate, but besides that, well, this $14 trillion worth of capital is being held up by roughly $40 billion of shareholder equity. That's like saying your house is held up by 8 to 10 really sturdy looking toothpicks. Right? So Larry Fink is in a very vulnerable position, right? Which means he's going to do whatever Larry Fink is told to do by the people that control the liquidity. So I don't think that the reason that Larry Fink says he's doing the things that he's doing is actually because they believe in them. But like, let's say Zionism, for instance, right? There's a lot of people that manage money that believe in that, right? And this is where this is where ideology constantly forces them to show their ass a bit, right? Make decisions that are contrary to their own personal interests, right? Because of an ideology. And we see that in a certain group of investors. And we don't see that from another group. I guess you could say, Jay, to poke a hole in my own argument, when something comes to like, personal safety or like ethnic interests, there are certain override buttons to that, right? Like they will, you can play around with your talk, like with your paradigm and try them on and pick them up and move them. But then there are certain things that have spiritual value or are valuable to like you, your ethnic cohort, and your progeny. And that's where you're not going to pick up ideology. So I guess I could poke holes in my own argument and point out the exceptions.
Well, I think that, one of the kind of long running debates in these circles is on exactly that point, right? Particularly as it regards social issues, right? Is the woke, right? And put scare quotes around that if you must, is that a sincerely held belief or not? If you listen to thinkers like, Academic Agent, a significant influence of mine, he will say, no, that is simply a convenient ruling formula, right? That will be, discarded as soon as it's convenient. Whereas others, and I think, Orrin McIntyre has kind of adopted the standard of saying like, no, this is the ideological end point, or at least the kind of current ideological end point of, a massive kind of like sweeping movement in Western thought, right? It's the end point of liberalism. And I realize, saying that I'm agnostic on the issue is probably very dissatisfying to my viewers, but I'm really not convinced either way because, as you said, right, there are these kind of like first order loyalties, right? For instance, to my favorite Middle Eastern democracy, right?
Yes.
People quite often make personally irrational choices to advance the goals of, such a nation. But on the other hand,
detriment.
To their own detriment, right? I mean, look at the Rosenbergs. And on the other hand, right, there are a number of people, saying a number of people is a massive understatement. Pretty much everyone will adopt positions that are convenient for them. I think that the fact that, for instance, the Ukraine war, which from a certain perspective literally doesn't matter at all, has become such a massive cause, in the U.S. Actually, to counter my own argument, you could say, well, why does Germany want to, blow up the Keystone pipeline? Why do they want to, not the Keystone pipeline, excuse me, the Nord Stream pipeline? Why did that happen? Why are they basically shooting themselves in the foot economically? And I realize that
the same reason they closed down their nuclear reactors. If you're about to have a sovereign debt default, right? You could either A, wait till you have a sovereign debt default, explain to the people that all their savings and all their pensions are gone, try and dodge hanging from a lamppost, which will be tricky because the people that protect you are also those people that are going to lose their pensions. Or you can try and put austerity measures on them beforehand and convince them through very clever marketing that these aren't actually austerity measures. This isn't actually a cage that I'm putting you in. It's in fact a new style of window dressing, right? That happens to look like bars, but really it's just fashion.
Oh,
so
see,
let me put them on your house.
That's a fascinating framework because actually I hadn't heard that explanation for the green movement. The
100%. Whose idea do you think it would be, right? And
So I just want to lay this out because this is the explanation I've heard, which I thought was interesting, is that basically the green movement is heavily funded by U.S. interest, right? The U.S. intelligence services, as a way to sandbag the European economy and keep Europe aligned with America, whereas if that was not the case, they would be more likely to align with Russia, for example.
That's very, very silly. So where do we start? All right. Do you know what a monopsony is?
No, I'm not familiar with that term.
Okay. So there's a monopoly, right? And there's a monopsony. So if monopoly is owning all the industry, right? Like let's say I'm going to own Boardwalk and Park Place and all the places, that the good hotels are going to go in, right? And I effectively have a monopoly on the good hotels, right? And I come up to you and say, well, Jay, I have something better than your monopoly. And you just say, what? There's nothing better than a monopoly. I'm going to say, yes, there is. You may own all the hotels, right? All the luxury hotels. But I own all the luxury hotel guests, right? I control all of your customers. You may control all of the material, all the products, but I control the people that buy them. So even though you have a monopoly on this entire industry, right? If I direct my customers somewhere else, or I don't allow you access to my customers in this particular instance, then, well, you're fucked. So that's a monopsony. And I'm going to drop something in the private chat that you can poke through later, and I will use this as an example because I'll touch on it several times. All right. So what is the green movement, for instance? Right. Well, it's about getting off of hydrocarbons, right? First, let me address the economic conditions, right? The U.S., to put it nicely, we don't need anyone. We don't need Europe. We don't care if they're tethered to us at all. And to give you an example, I can add up all of the European capital market, every single European savings account, like every one of their checking accounts, all the gold that they've got hidden underneath their bed, all of the European stocks that are on the European Stock Exchange, all the private companies, literally all of the capital in Europe. And then I can go to India and I do the same thing, right? And I got my European pot full of all the capital. I've got my Indian pot full of all the capital. And then I go to China. And then I get all the China capital. I put it all in a pot. And the Japan capital and the Indonesian capital, all of the capital. And then I take all of those little pots and I pour them all together. And I got this one big pot. Right? And then I come to the US. And it's a big empty pot. And I pour all of the giant pot, the rest of the world's pot, into the US. And I won't even fill it up a third. Right? You could take the entire world's capital markets, all of it, and it won't even fill a couple inches of our swimming pool. People that say that have absolutely no idea exactly how rich and exactly how big the US is from the point of wealth. You could say, oh, well, look at China's GDP. It's surpassing us, right? Okay. That's like you, right? You understand, capital gains, right? If I make all of my money on capital gains, right? Let's say I inherited $1 billion, right? And I get, $100 million every year, right? And let's say you, make, I don't know, $1 million a month. And you come to me and you say, Stormy, I made more than you this month. Right? My paycheck's bigger than yours. I earn more money. My salary's larger. And I'm going to look at you and I'm going to say, but Jay, I don't care about salary. Like, your salary's bigger than mine, but I've got $1 billion. And most of my money comes from the interest earned on that $1 billion. You're going to say, oh, but my paycheck is bigger than yours. My GDP is bigger than yours. I'm going to say, that's nice. But I'm sitting on $1 billion. Right? So the idea that the US needs to tether Europe to it is very, very silly for economic reasons. Geostrategic, I would believe more, but not for economic reasons. For instance, the green policies, right? We very often, for being political realists or Machiavellians that we think we are, we very rarely apply those things, right? Because we don't know in our own paradigm what is ideology and what is not. Right? We've been told our whole lives that the U.S. is an empire and we run everything and everything is just vassal states everywhere and everyone has to do what we say, and they're really all just franchises, because we came up and we're raised in a media environment that was largely left-leaning and views everything in the forms of like capital and labor and all this other bullshit. Right? So we just assume as first principles that all of these places are fiefdoms of ours. So they can't possibly have any agency. Right? And that's wrong. And if we were to examine it, with our now clear eyes, we would see that that's a very silly thing to believe, but we just assumed it. Right? We didn't replace all of our first principles. Right? Some snuck in.
So Stormy,
go on.
The formulation you'll oftentimes hear is that sovereignty is basically determined by that question of, are you able to go to war? The classic line of thinking would be in the post-Nuremberg reality, the vast majority of nation states are not allowed to declare war. That's basically illegal, and so they are no longer sovereign. What would your response be to that? And then I'll let you keep going.
Europe has borrowed. Well, okay, so put it this way. Does Israel have the ability to go to war?
Yes, although I would say Israel exists as sort of a Schmittian exception.
Okay, but how do they go to war?
They just do it, right? They don't really. Okay,
they get the U.S. to do it.
Well, yes, okay.
And that's what NATO is, right? Well, the thing about bureaucracy is eventually it starts going out for its own interests, right? And NATO has kind of become its own thing. And to give you an idea, all you have to do is like go to your search bar and type in NATO fears Trump. And you'll be amazed at what you see. Why is every NATO apparatchik, the head of NATO, why is the head of NATO saying that Donald Trump is the greatest threat to NATO? Isn't Putin the greatest threat to NATO? Why would Donald Trump be? Oh, because Donald Trump wants to get out of NATO. So therefore, you've had this entity, right? Europe has had this exception of being able to wield U.S. military might without actually possessing it itself, kind of hoping we don't notice, right? Or the bureaucratic momentum, right, is enough to carry it through, right? You really just you could do it like, through 3 or 4 institutions, right? The Atlantic Council, Council on Foreign Relations, and maybe a couple think tanks, particularly CSIS, right? CSIS is a NATO think tank that constantly advocates for things that are detrimental to the U.S. and great for NATO and the European member states. And you'd be really amazed at how much of the initiatives of CSIS become U.S. policy because our fucking politicians are very cheap, in fact. A friend of mine, a hedge fund friend of mine, ran an experiment, which I can go like it's a little bit of a story, but he basically found out how much it cost per politician by inviting. He didn't do it; he had a bunch of his analysts do it. But anyways, it's about $50,000 to get a congressman to do whatever you want. $250,000 to get it if that congressman is the chairman of a committee. And roughly about $500,000 if it's a senator on the chairman of a committee. Could be even more depending on what it is. And the average price to get a senator to vote in pretty much any way you want to is roughly about $100,000 and $150,000. So with a very small amount of money, you could do a lot of damage. As a small Middle Eastern country has done to great effect, and I mean Saudi Arabia, obviously. right? So to give you an idea of like the green energy thing is actually the perfect example, right? And like a simple like who benefits from this analysis is really all you need, right? So what economic zone, right? Since they're more multi, we'll treat all of the other actors outside of the U.S. are kind of multinational, coalitions or economic zones, right? So what economic zone would benefit the most from the entire world shooting itself straight in the cock, right? And handicapping itself for eternity by getting off of the most energy dense fuel source known to man, right? Fossil fuels have a higher energy density than uranium, right? So like a natural gas plant is, cranks out more power than a nuclear power plant. So in whose best interest would it be if the world gets rid of the most valuable and efficient power generating methodology? Well, easy. The nation that doesn't have any fucking hydrocarbons, that's who. Well, what economic zone doesn't have any hydrocarbons? North America, Canada, and the US, metric tons of hydrocarbons. South America, metric tons of hydrocarbons. Southeast Asia, so China doesn't have any of their own, but they basically have Indonesia, by flipping a light switch. So they've got a metric fuck ton of hydrocarbons. What about Russia? Yep, metric fuck ton of hydrocarbons there. Africa, yep, metric fuck ton of hydrocarbons there. Europe, 0 hydrocarbons. So in whose economic best interest would it be if the world decided to make itself as retarded as they are? It would benefit them.
So, accepting your model, right? Why is this idea catching on in the U.S.? I mean, I know maybe it's simply the fact that they're being bribed, right? Which is a distinct possibility.
Politically, yes, but everything is about the Great Reset, right? We watched the Great Reset play out everywhere all at once, right?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, no worries. The Great Reset is a marketing plan for sovereign debt default. That's what it is. It's selling you austerity. It's making austerity measures sound cool to you, right? Sound trendy and futuristic and, most importantly, sophisticated.
So, Stormy, yet again, I'm going to ask a leading question here. Why is that necessary, right? Why is there a need to sort of relieve pressure?
Currency risk. Well, you're basically staring down a sovereign debt collapse. Not the US, but everybody else. Right? So everybody okay, the US dollar, well, I've had this conversation, and this will also, we think a lot more people are in charge than are really in charge. Or a lot more, we assume that a lot of the people in charge that we see in charge know what's happening, and that's not necessarily the case. Because I had this conversation with someone who was a former Fed governor, right? Not New York Fed, but the Atlanta Fed. They should know this. And another person that sat on the LIBOR committee for 15 years. So Tom Luongo's thesis is right, by the way, everybody. Right? It's not just him. It's like Martin Armstrong predicted a cascading sovereign debt collapse 10 years ago. Right? It's in the math. Right? It's not really a negotiable. All right. But so I'm trying to figure out how to do it quickly, but briefly, 9 out of every $10 isn't printed in the US, right? And nobody actually prints money, right? Money is created through debt, right? And basically they issue new loans in dollars, right? So 9 out of every $10, right, are created outside of the US. And those 9 out of every $10, right, those new loans are indexed to what's called LIBOR. LIBOR is the London Interbank Overnight Exchange Rate. So as in not in the US at all, right? There's 20 banks on the LIBOR committee, not a single fucking one of them is American. So that means 9 out of every $10, or 9 out of every 10 newly dollar denominated loans, is created overseas by overseas banks and indexed to an interest rate that's not the Federal Reserve rate at all. It's actually the London Overnight Interbank Exchange Rate, which is set in London. So if 9/10 of every dollar is an offshore dollar and indexed to an interest rate that's not the Federal Reserve rate, then who exactly is in control of the US monetary system? Or sorry, the global dollar reserve system? It's not the Federal Reserve. If I own 90% of your stock, that's not your company anymore. That's my company. You may think it's your company, but wait till the next shareholder vote and you'll find out it's not. And that system has worked really well for the rest of the world. Right? Being able to borrow money in dollars whenever you want has been great for them. It has been a disaster for us. It's the reason, right? Well, I'll get into that later. Remind me, Jay, to ask why COVID and why 2008, right?
Of course.
So this being able to issue new dollars or new dollar denominated loans whenever you want and index to a rate that's not local, all right, has been the wind beneath the wings of the rest of the world, right? Globalism exists because of this, right? The Chinese people did not lift 500 million people out of poverty. The United States lifted 500 million Chinese people out of poverty. It had nothing fucking to do with the Chinese, right? And that thesis will be confirmed in about, I don't know, 2 years, and we'll see how well they pull themselves out of the poverty they're about to be in all by themselves. We'll see. So all the China freaks that are going to like mog me in the comments, we'll see.
I'm actually curious. Sorry, not to get on yet another digression.
No worries.
What do you mean by that? So, okay, how about I give you my 85 IQ version of this argument, which is basically China is facing a massive demographic decline, and where they effectively have a massive overpopulation of men and old people, and it seems like they're not having babies at an appropriate rate to sustain that sort of aging population. And also, an immense amount of the Chinese economy is basically fake. It's tied up in large sort of like real estate and building concerns, and the rest of it is basically tied to the U.S. economy. Is that in any way an acceptable explanation for why China is sort of a paper tiger, as it's been said before?
Yeah, it is. And actually, what if the U.S., no matter how much it hurt, just suddenly walked away from China tomorrow? Would China go into economic seizures instantaneously?
I mean, yes, it seems like it would.
That's a monopsony.
Oh, okay, I see. That was actually a very neat way to explain that term. But sorry, carry on. I interrupted you.
No worries. So, yes, and deglobalization is happening whether China likes it or not, right? And it's not so much that we're doing it for strategic interest, which we are, right? Military supply chain interest, which we are. But the system that enabled that to be economical, right? Offshoring. It's that system that's breaking, right? Offshoring isn't going to work anymore financially. There will no longer be an incentive for it to work, right? So the demographic realities and the real estate realities, right? Let's put it this way. So everyone watched Evergrande blow up and almost take the whole market down with it. And all of the Chinese real estate developers are just as bad. And most are, in fact, worse. But what you'll be surprised to hear is that Evergrande wasn't even in the top 50 in size. So if Evergrande almost took out the Chinese economy, how is, I think it's called something garden, not Market Garden, that was a World War II mission to airdrop into like Denmark or something.
I'm guessing it's not Olive Garden.
It might be. It may in fact be Olive Garden. Green. Anyways, you can look it up. Just look at the. Anyways, so there's way bigger bombs that are about to go off in the Chinese economy. It's kind of already it's happening now, right? So I mean, this hypothetical that we're analyzing, right? We're batting back and forth, is happening like as we speak, and will happen within the next couple months, right? So I said, it was either in group chats or on the timeline. It often gets blurred, but when the Chinese first announced the first wave of monetary stimulus, I said it's not going to work, and the first time's not going to make a dent. Zero Hedge made the same prediction, and they're going to do it again, and it's going to work for about a day, and then they're going to do it a third time with everything that they have, and it'll work for about a month, maybe 3 weeks, because the demand isn't there, right? Stimulating the economy with money only works if you have people, right, to then put that money to work in the form of demand. And as Mr. Burden so clearly laid out in regards to the demographic realities of China, the people that are needed don't exist. So it doesn't matter how much you stimulate the economy. Grandma can only buy so many houses. She already has 6 or 8 or 10. It doesn't matter, right? Eventually, the property developers, I mean, just in the state of real estate, you can copy and paste this to every vertical in the Chinese economy, right? The property market is going to be much like our property market, but to a much lesser degree, right? And this like, actually, let me pivot this into a white pill. I know your audience steers younger, right? But the boomer generation was a fucking freak show, right? Is a nonlinear system, right? I talk about who is that? Like, remember, everyone remembers in Jurassic Park, there was like that Jewish guy that always plays, you know, that Jewish guy, and he's like doing like the drop of water on your hand, like, and he says like it's chaos theory. It's A, that's not what chaos theory is, and B, it's also not called chaos theory. It's called nonlinear system dynamics. And basically, what it is like, let's say on your desk you only have 5 items on your desk, and that means the most combination of those items, you can move them whatever way you want to, but you're only going to get maybe 25 different layouts, right? So that system is very simple. You know all the variables in it, and therefore you can predict really everything that those objects on your desk can do. You know, they can only be so many places, and the answer is 5 or 25 places. That's how many places they can be. But what's actually true is that if you run that 100 million times, one time, it's not going to be 25 different places. It's going to be 25 billion places, right? Which means like you can know everything about a system. And every once in a blue moon, that system will throw out a result that is impossible. Right? This is the butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, kicks off a hurricane in Texas. Weather is a very simple thing to model. This theory was discovered by somebody trying to, in a very rudimentary MIT computer lab, when computers were the size of houses, tried to predict and model the weather, which should be fucking very simple. It's only 6, maybe 8 max variables. It's a system that should be able to be modeled. But what he found out is that the tiniest little input, the tiniest, grain of sand could, if you run that 100,000 times, 1,000,000 times, 1 in a million times, that grain of sand is going to snowball into an avalanche, and you're going to get a result that's not possible, or that you previously thought not possible. And that's the boomer generation. Because the other way that this theory was validated, right, was actually modeling population. And population is an even simpler system. And it turns out that every now and then it throws out a freak occurrence, something so outside of your paradigm that you can't even model it. So South America as a continent didn't fight in World War II. Vietnam didn't fight in World War II. Right? Neither did Africa. But the narrative about the boomer generation is that everybody went and fought in World War II and came back and, fucked a lot. It was great. A lot of babies. So that got us 5 times the amount of boomers than there was in any previous generation in the US, and the same in Europe. But that 5x population increase happened everywhere, right? India has a boomer generation. South America has a boomer generation. All these nations, all these areas that should not have had a population explosion in one generation did. Right? And then immediately afterwards, the system returned back to relatively normal. So that means if I add up the Zoomers and the Millennials, and I put them together, there is still 5 times as many boomers. So just like the people in China are about to find out, how do you sell, like let's say right now, everyone cries because houses are crazy, stupid, expensive, right? And a Zoomer that has just a regular guy job, there's no way in a million fucking years he can afford a house and start a family, because that house is appreciating faster than he can save up money for a down payment. Well, if the boomers have all the houses, and there's 5 times as many of them as there are of you, right? And they're dying rapidly. We're already 30% of the boomer generation down, right? How do you sell 5 houses to one person? One of 2 things will happen. Either A, that person that's buying suddenly becomes 5 times richer, or that house becomes 90%, 80%, plus some overcorrection, 90% cheaper. One of those 2 things has to happen.
Well, and
Doesn't
there's
matter how many immigrants you import.
There's a secondary effect going on at the same time, and I know a little bit about this from a previous career, but effectively,
You're talking about pension funds.
a little bit, yeah. Well, effectively, right? One of the sort of, excuse me, I'm fumbling for words here. One of the things that has happened really since the 2000s, right, is that as homes have sort of shifted from a place you live to an investment asset, right, the size and cost of homes has ballooned massively, right? Yes. And a big part of that is that effectively, we did have this incredibly large, wealthy boomer generation, and a lot of them didn't actually save very much money. And so effectively, a lot of these people are using their home equity to fund their retirement, right? And obviously, you see that on social media in the form of, some boomer who worked in the post office who's, squandering it all on a $300,000, RV, which, okay, sure, that happens. But for a lot of these people, they just were not particularly financially intelligent, right? They kind of rode the wave of, this sort of like incredible confluence of events, but didn't actually, take normal precautions with savings. And so effectively, you have a ton of people who need property values to keep going up so they can cash out. But the problem is, like you said, we're 30% down on this generation. And if you have that remaining 70% who needs to cash out, it's not even just that they're dying, but before they die, they need to, get their money, quote unquote, out of their house. But sorry, back to you, Stormy.
No, that's exactly correct. All right. And what about the banks? Right? If I lend you, right, like let's say you live in $1 million house, right? And I give you a mortgage, like I lend you $5 million against that house, right? Or more realistically, right? There's $1 million house that because of COVID and because of a bunch of other dumb shit, right? And boomer retirement mathematics, that $1 million house is now priced at $5 million. Right? This is something that everybody can relate to. Right? Seeing a house that was 10 years ago, 1/5 is cheap, right? And let's say, you want to be the idiot that buys this $5 million house, and a bank is going to give you a mortgage for $5 million, right? But there's only so many COVIDs. There's only so many externalities. So eventually, and we're rapidly approaching that right now, that house is going to go back to being worth $1 million. But I've got a real fucking problem now, because you have a house that's worth $1 million, right? But yet you owe me $5 million. Let's say you get hit by a bus, or more likely, right, you default, walk away from the loan. You're not going to keep on paying $5 million for a house that's only worth $1 million and be trapped there for 1 million years. Right? That puts me, the financial institution, in a really bad spot, because you're going to default. And when I try and get my collateral, I'm going to find out that I'm $4 million short. Now take that and times it by 100, and that'll be how many mortgages are in a book. All right, now take that book and times that by about 1 million. And that's about how many more books of mortgages get sold every, week to pension funds, endowments, other governments, central banks, literally the whole system. Right, so the entire system now cannot afford that house to go down in value, because if it does, the bank that's holding all those books of mortgages, right, they'll try and hide it at first, yeah, I'm sure. But eventually, remember that information asymmetry, tying it all the way back to the beginning, look at that. That information asymmetry is going to get taken advantage of, right? And I'm going to see some guy shorting millions and millions of dollars worth of this bank's shares. And I'm going to go, what the fuck does he know? He knows something. And then I'm going to start looking at that bank, and I'm going to go, oh, I think I know what it is. And then I'm going to get short millions and millions and millions of dollars. And then other people are going to start seeing me and seeing him. And at that point in time, it doesn't even matter. They don't even have to see the research that I did and that he did before me. They're just piling on. And that bank chairman is about to put his pistol in his mouth because his share price is cratering and he can't stop it. All because some guy looked at the book of mortgages, the liabilities on the bank's balance sheet, and then went and looked at the underlying value of all those homes in those mortgages and goes, wait a second, there is a 80% difference between liabilities, the prices on the mortgages, and the collateral, the value of the homes underlying those mortgages. This bank is a ticking fucking time bomb. I'm going to get short. And then everybody's going to get short. So they can't, and just extrapolate that hedge fund scenario and that bank, the publicly traded bank scenario, and now scale that up to the nation, right? Because now we're basically poking at a much bigger issue, right? We're kind of doing so much of what the right has to do, talk in euphemisms, right? So we're going to say, you know, the houses, the mortgages, the banks, we'll just use these as euphemisms for entire economies, right? Central banks and nations. And that's basically the same problem that that bank is in with those mortgages, is the same exact problem on a different scale and different underlying collateral as these central banks are. And it's not really just like my opinion. KPMG actually got sued by the nation of Germany because it had its, Germany requested KPMG to do an audit of the Bundesbank. And the Bundesbank, you know, let KPMG into their books. And KPMG comes out and says, oh wait, the Bundesbank, the German central bank, is $90 billion in the red, right? And it has no way of recapitalizing itself. So it has $90 billion worth of insolvency risk. And then the Bundesbank didn't want anybody to know about that. So it sued KPMG, but luckily in this one instance, luckily that KPMG is a global institution and had to weigh its credibility globally off of the needs of, you know, in comparison to the needs of Germany, and decided that it was worth, you know, maintaining that credibility and, you know, saying, fuck you, Germany. And now I know about it. And that's a real problem because there's really only two functioning economies in Europe. There's Germany and there's France. France is even worse. But that's really it. That's the whole Eurozone. So and Germany is actually much less of a basket case than France is. And if Germany is already insolvent, I already know everybody else is insolvent. And that poses a really big problem because unlike the Federal Reserve, which has the ability to recapitalize itself, the European Central Bank does not. Right? The European Central Bank needs all the other member states to agree to recapitalize it. And that's never going to fucking happen because A, last time this happened, Germany and France cannibalized Greece, Italy, Spain, and a bunch of the other small member states of Europe and basically forced austerity on them to siphon the capital out of their economies to keep themselves alive. So they're not going to bite. They're going to be like, fuck you. We did this already. And you basically, you know, slit our throats and hung us upside down and drained us dry. We're not going to do that again. And then there's the other European member states, like let's say Poland and Hungary, that don't like, you know, a bunch of euphemisms, don't like a bunch of, let's say, different ethnic cohorts coming into the country or they don't like certain sexual paraphilias or whatever. And they're being sanctioned, literally being sanctioned by the European Union. So wait a second. You're sanctioned. I'm part of this little group, right? And as a group, you're going to sanction me and hurt my citizenry. But then now you found yourself in a really fucked up financial position, and now you need me to come bail you out so you can keep on sanctioning me? How about I don't do that?
So you asked me to remind you of something, right? Which is a connection between 2008 and COVID.
Okay, so COVID was a scam, but not for the reasons that you think. So I mentioned this a little bit on Jason's podcast, 2-Bit Podcast. I highly recommend it. I have great guests, not just myself, but also myself. And I think I also mentioned this. If anything I'm saying sounds very interesting to you and something you would like to, dig deep on, I did a podcast with a guy by the name of Peruvian Bull. He's a finance guy. And I know him personally. He's a great guy.
Well, then tell him to respond to his DMs.
I'll do that right now, because that's something I will forget about. And I have hardcore ADHD, so I don't consider it nagging. I know for a fact that unless you remind me multiple times, I will forget.
Oh, no worries, dude. I'm mostly just kind of lightly making fun of him. I know he's a very busy gentleman, but yeah, nonetheless.
Not busy enough to be that rude. There. Stop being a F-slur and respond to James Burton's DMs.
Now I'm going to feel like a dick. But anyway, sorry, dude. Back to you.
Well, I like this show quite a bit. I've been a long time listener, so I find that very offensive. I don't like that. He's gonna respond now. So if you want to go dig deeper and deeper, he and I do a 2.5-hour deep dive on this system, how it came to exist, what individual actors created it, and kind of like anyways, if this sounds interesting to you, it's on his Substack and go fish it out. Okay, so COVID. So what happened right before COVID? Right, this whole system. Have you ever heard the term liquidity crisis? We're going to have a liquidity crisis.
Yes.
Okay.
But you should probably explain that for the people who don't have a useless finance degree.
Okay. I think I'll best explain it by just talking about events. And because a liquidity crisis can actually come from a whole bunch of different things. Most of those things are relevant to this particular. He apologizes because he didn't see it.
Well, I appreciate that. This is really why I have a podcast, not to talk to you, but just to wedge your social connections. Right? It's just a giant pyramid scheme. But anyway, back to you.
No, seriously. So right before COVID, in August of 2019, anybody can just hop on Zero Hedge or hop on, just do custom search and search by times. And they will find in August of 2019 something called the repo crisis, particularly the reverse repo crisis. And what the repo crisis is it's in reference to the repo window, which is the Federal Reserve's repo window, which is where a bank goes if they need to borrow money and it's an emergency. And the overnight repo is called the overnight repo because it's only a 24-hour loan. So that means that all of the banks that ever go to that window don't have enough capital to cover their expenses, literally keep the lights on for 24 hours. So you don't want to be seen in the repo window. But all of a sudden, overnight, we have a metric fuck ton of banks and the line stretching around the corner. What's happening? Well, 2 weeks before that, Jamie Dimon, who's probably one of the most interesting men alive, right? Everybody's excited because Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen are poking around our politics. It's more than just those guys. It is. Side note, everybody should go look at Jamie Dimon's little news appearance on the BBC, or BBC was the reporter at Davos of 2023. If you ever want to see a BBC woman clutch her pearls so hard she almost falls out of her chair as she audibly gasps for air, it's very interesting. If you want to see the type of person Jamie Dimon is, he's not a friend, but he's also not an enemy. I'm getting all these excuses for why he hasn't responded. All right, I'm gonna have to message him a little bit. Like, all right. Anyways, so Jamie Dimon, 3 weeks prior, comes out and says, "We will no longer be taking European corporate debt as collateral," which is another way of saying we don't think any European corporation is going to be able to pay its bills, right? So their debt is no good. IOUs from European corporations are like IOUs from, that guy in that stealing my bike analogy, the same guy, right? Very low credit score. And when Jamie Dimon says something, it's kind of like seeing those, me and that other guy take these massive short positions on that bank, right? Jamie Dimon is a type of person where if he says he's going to do something, you're just going to do it, right? It may as well be God Almighty coming down and saying, "Thou shalt not take European sovereign or European corporate debt as collateral," because by the end of the trading day, every other investment bank on Wall Street did the exact same thing, because none of those banks can afford, really no one on earth can afford to call Jamie Dimon's bluff, right? If he says that this is going to be a dumpster fire and you need to get out of it, you could not, but can you really afford to risk him being right? Anyways, chaos ensued. And then the week after, Jamie Dimon comes out again and he says, JP Morgan will no longer be accepting European sovereign debt as collateral. And the market went nuts. And the very next day, you had a line of banks around the corner that couldn't fund their operations for 24 hours. Right? You had a liquidity crisis, because how collateral works is, how money is printed, how dollars are printed is, Jay Burton in this analogy is Mr. Jerome Powell, right? Jay is going to say, "Hey, Stormy, do you want to buy any treasuries? I've got a bunch of treasury bonds." And I'll say, "Well, I will take, X amount of those treasuries at X amount of interest rate." And I'm going to say, "Okay." I'm going to turn around and I'm going to place them right in my vault. And when treasury bonds pass the threshold of my vault, what is the process that the Eucharist, transubstantiation happens. And those treasury bonds are no longer treasury bonds anymore when they cross that border. They are now reserves. And once they're reserves, I can then lend 9-10 times that amount of money out. So if I only got $1 million in my pocket and I lend out $9 million, I've now created $8 million that didn't exist.
So wait, Stormy,
Yeah.
I'm familiar with this concept, but isn't the current, and I forget the exact term for this, but it's not the required minimum. What's the
reserve
term?
rate.
Reserve rate. Isn't the current reserve rate 0?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, carry on.
Yes, it is. um, and why is that reserve rate 0? Because now it can be, right? The reserve rate is 0 because SOFR happened. Right? We've de-risked our financial system considerably. As in, like, we decoupled from our largest source of risk, which is the offshore dollar system, right? Well, I call them European banks, but they really are global, right? HSBC is all around the world and is called many other things besides HSBC, like Chase Bank. Chase Bank's not a U.S. bank. Or sorry, Citibank is not a U.S. bank, nor is Bank of America, by the way. It's Bank of America is the hello, my fellow whites of banks. It's barely a bank, and there's nothing American about it. So when I say, like, these European banks or these, it's not geographically isolated, right? Bank of America is an Italian bank. Gross. But anyways, once those, things treasuries become reserves, and then I go and I create more loans than I have reserves in there, I've effectively printed those dollars, right? If you and I are stranded on an island and I have $10 and I lend you $10 at 10% interest, at the end of that year, you have to come up with $1. But you and I are on an island, and the only $10 in existence I lent you. So where the fuck are you going to come up with my dollar? You're not. That other dollar does not exist. So that's kind of how money is created, right? I am, through loans, creating money that does not exist. That's how money is printed. So I think there's like 2 actual money printers that print hard money. Everything else is just loans in a computer. So when I say that these banks are having a liquidity crisis, that means they are having a dollar crisis, right? They need liquidity. They need liquid pools of capital. And how is capital created? It's created by treasuries and dollar-denominated loans. So basically, when we say a liquidity crisis, we mean that we're not allowing them to give us European sovereign debt as collateral and then lending against that collateral, right? So that's the liquidity we're talking about. I know this is very confusing, so I'm trying to broad brush it as much as possible. Right? They needed many, many trillions of dollars, right, of treasury bonds to be created that did not exist, right? I needed Jerome Powell J. Burden to give me way, way, way more treasury bonds than he had. He's like, Stormy, I only have this much, remember? That's it. And I'm like, well, fuck. I need to issue all these more loans because I owe monies, because banks owe just as much as they take in. And if you're telling me there's not enough treasury bonds for you to give me any more, how am I going to make more loans? Right? There is a shortage here. There's a crisis. So what do you know? All right. So by the end of October, we're into September. Repo crisis is in full swing. But then a miracle happens. God himself sent down a virus in the nick of time, right? The very month we needed it. A virus came down from heaven to shut down all of our economies and cause the treasury bond creating machine called the US government to print exactly the amount of treasuries needed. $6 trillion. That then obviously gets turned into many, many, many more dollars through the process I'm describing now. But we didn't have any liquidity, There were no treasuries to be had anywhere. But then a virus came to shut down the economy and caused the government to spit out $6 trillion exactly when I needed $6 trillion of collateral. And that collateral I'm going to lend out many more times over because I have a fucking much bigger hole to plug than 6 trillion. So right when we needed it, COVID provided the bailout for roughly the exact amount of money they needed. And you can't crank out $6 trillion in treasuries that quickly, right? Because those treasuries are going to be immediately monetized, right? They're going to be stuffed into vaults so fucking fast it'll make your head spin, and then the loan printer is already printing before the treasuries even get set on their shelf. So that is going to create a metric fuck ton of what's called M2, right? The dollars you and I spend, or around globally. Anyways, so how do we stop rapid hyperinflation from happening? If only there was some way that we could put the economy into a type of stasis, right? Like a coma. Or else, because if we don't, the economy is going to rapidly overheat. That is actually the technical term, by the way. It'll overheat, and the inflation will onset very rapidly, and it'll turn into hyperinflation in a month. So how do we stop this? How do we put the economy into a medically induced coma? Freeze it, lock it down, so to speak. How do we do this? Well, we lock it down, so to speak, and literally. And you can actually watch when these countries and, economic regions of the United States, whenever inflation was starting to heat up, lockdown, all of a sudden the PCR machine got cranked to 9,000, and all of a sudden the new cases are everywhere. Oh my fucking God, we have to lock down again. We thought we were doing okay, guys, but, PCR test machine is telling us there's a COVID outbreak. COVID is coming back super strong in this particular area. We need to lock down again. That was close, right? Managed to tamp down that inflation by putting the economy brakes back on the economy exactly when we needed it to. So now let's talk about 2008. You were probably told that BIPOC people got a bunch of loans for houses they couldn't afford, and those loans were adjustable rate loans, and then all of a sudden the interest rate, moved around a little bit, and their payments ballooned, and they weren't able to afford those loans anymore. And so they foreclosed, and then all of the foreclosures happened at once, and our banks are now in big trouble. So we need to bail out our banks. That's the story I was told. And that's the story you were told. But those ARM loans, adjustable rate mortgages, they should probably be called Oswald loans, because that's exactly what they are. They're Lee Harvey Oswald loans. They are a patsy, right? The fucking mortgages had nothing to do with it, right? That was the offshore dollar market seizing up for the very first time. And it didn't even need Jamie Dimon to kick off. Jamie Dimon just kicked the most recent one off himself on purpose, for reasons that will take another podcast to explain, so I won't. The first time it blew up all organically, and we printed roughly $7 trillion back when that was worth a lot more. So where did that money go? Where did those bailout funds go? And why did the government need to keep it secret under a tarp? so to speak. Well, you would be shocked. And in fact, the citizenry would have been shocked if they had known, and Barack Obama's head would have been on a spike. So that's why you needed the mortgage backstory, the all that stuff. Because if he was going to say that we needed to print up $7 trillion to bail out foreign banks, you would have lost your mind. But that's exactly what he did. $1.2 trillion to HSBC. $1.14 trillion to Deutsche Bank. $0.9 trillion to Nomura Bank. $0.75 trillion to Barclays, and on and on and on down the list. U.S. banks got less than 4% of that bailout money because U.S. banks didn't need it. The offshore dollar market did. But yet you paid for that bailout, right? Your quality of life decreased. All those treasury bonds that were created, all those IOUs, you're getting taxed to pay the interest on them, but you didn't benefit from the loans that were created off of them. And this is why I say the Chinese didn't lift 500 million people out of poverty. We did. That wealth that has raised the rest of this, the whole seething mass of third world refuse, lifted them up above their poverty, right? Above their little dirt huts, into modernity. That wealth that was created in these places, those loans that those Chinese banks got to give U.S. corporations to build their factories so they could take your jobs away without losing too much money. And because we lifted those people out of poverty, they worked for pennies. And now all of a sudden, offshoring made sense economically, right? Because dollars can be printed by any bank in the world, right? Because if I were to actually lend money correctly, right, in China or Bangladesh, I would have to pay Bangladesh interest rates, right? Interest rates reflect the rate of default, right? The risk. Well, Bangladesh is a bombed out shithole. So your Mercedes dealership that you want to build in Bangladesh probably doesn't have the highest chance of success. And that's why a Bangladeshi businessman would probably pay 13, 14, 15% interest. But if he goes to the bank will say, hey, if you want to borrow that money, you could pay this 15% interest over here, and it's going to be rough. But if you borrow in US dollars instead of Bangladeshi bucks or whatever the fuck they use, your interest rate will be 3%. Well, you do the math. Bangladeshi businessmen, would you want to pay 15% interest or 3? I'm going to go with 3. And for quite a while, that 3% as opposed to that 15% was, like I said, the wind beneath the wings of the third world, right? Lifted them all up high above the clouds. And it got even better because my whole life, like I said, either earlier before we were recording or on previous, appearances I've made, I'm in my mid-30s. And every single year of my life, the Federal Reserve would lower interest rates, not raise them. So that Bangladeshi businessman that already had a fucking sweet deal, he got to turn around and refinance at a lower rate. He even got to chalk up the difference between his previous mortgage or his previous loan payment and his new much lower loan payment as profit. And we were dumb enough to believe it. And all of a sudden, all these offshore businesses became muy profitable. Not only were they cranking out slave labor, which is cheap, right? But the constant refinancing being booked as profit made the transporting of all these fucking goods everywhere, which makes no sense, seem economical. And so it went. As wealth was sucked away and sucked away and sucked away out of literally a country so wealthy, it would be hard to convince anyone in any other time that it wasn't blessed by God himself. And it was vampirized. But then all of a sudden the interest rates did go up for the very first time. Right after Jamie Dimon did that thing I was talking about earlier. First interest rate hike. And then all of a sudden, that adjustable rate loan that Bangladeshi businessman has had, that he's been able to watch the interest rate go down and the profitability of his company go up. Well, now it went up. And that means he's in big fucking trouble. And why is he in big trouble? Well, currency risk. Something that we thought didn't exist, or at least anybody in the decision-making seats at these banks thought didn't exist. Because like I said, my 35 years on this planet, 36 years on this planet, interest rates have only gone down, right? So that means everybody in the decision-making seats at any one of these banks all around the world, 35 years ago, they didn't even work there. They were still in college, right? So they've never actually seen an interest rate environment that goes up. That's a big problem. So that means they didn't see this shit coming, right? Like, I've never seen an elephant fall out of the sky, right? So that means I don't go around my day-to-day with a helmet on and a stainless steel umbrella in case an elephant falls out of the sky. I don't even think that's possible because I've never seen it. So, anyways, that Bangladeshi businessman is in real trouble because he has to pay that loan payment in dollars, right? But now that the Fed raised interest rates, you watched the value, and you can go back and look at this. Every time the Fed raises interest rates, all the other currencies besides the dollar take a fucking nosedive. Okay? So that means not only has the payment that he has to pay in dollars gone up, the value of his Bangladeshi bucks has gone down. So that means it takes him more Bangladeshi bucks to get a dollar. And the amount of dollars he has to cough up every month keeps going up by a lot. So that wind beneath his wings is now a millstone around his neck, and he is slowly drowning. And so is that bank that lent him the money, because all the other clients are drowning too. And the Bangladeshi central bank that backstops all those banks, now it's in trouble too. And you can take that and copy and paste for every single nation in the world. And that's how you have a global sovereign debt default.
So Stormy, we are fast coming up on time. This has been fascinating. I'm gonna have to have you come back on, man. But if people want to find you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I don't produce any content. I don't have so I guess just follow me on Twitter. Just search Stormy Waters, and I'm the first one that pops up. I believe I'm the only Stormy Waters with a check mark. But if you want the actual handle, it's at Norman Dodd, D-O-D-D, _ new, as in K-N-E-W.
Well, I will be sure to link that. Your Twitter is highly recommended. Again, man, thank you so much for coming on. I oftentimes say that you can directly track how much I'm enjoying an interview by how long it goes for. And I think you're currently sitting in my top 3. I very rarely let it get past an hour. Although I will say Gio Panicetti has gotten 2 episodes over 2 hours, which has more to do with the fact that he is an unstoppable force. And so the fact that you managed to clear an hour and a half is quite the testament, man.
Or it's either a testament to my inability to stay on topic.
Or my social inability to tell you to shut up is another alternative.
I will. I look forward to coming back on after Peruvian Bolt does.
Yeah, sure thing,
or
man.
Actually, or maybe the 2 of us will. Who knows?
Yeah, really. Just to really get me out of my comfort zone where I get past the thoroughly subpar finance education I received. Anyway, again, man, thank you so much for coming on. It was a great time. Be sure to check out Stormy Waters' Twitter, linked in the description. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you're feeling generous, the best way to support us is through our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. The business there has been growing pretty well. There's a lot of users. About 40 of them came directly through the podcast, which is quite good. Look, I'll be honest. I podcast because I enjoy it, not to make money. JD's a personal friend of mine. I would be hawking his stuff regardless. I believe in it, use it 4 times a week. And I've been to enough of these live events to know that some of you guys could really use some personal training. And JD's the best way to do that.
That's awesome. I'm really glad somebody's starting a business. Everyone wants to oh, you got to be building, man. You got to be building. Like, okay, what the fuck should I be building? There's no follow on to that statement, nor do they even know. Nor does anybody to say this is how you build stuff. So I'm really glad to see that the business that somebody decided to start in our sphere that isn't the 1,000th, small independent, indie book publisher, or small, magazine, or everybody's oh, I'm going to start a thing. And they always decide to start the thing that everybody else has always started. So when you started pitching Axios, I was like, that is an interesting concept. Somebody's doing something new that's different. So it's good to see that he's a success. And anybody listening, if you want to, start your own thing, don't do the same fucking thing that everybody else is doing.
See, here's what you need to do if you want to be original on the internet. Start a podcast. Anyway,
or Substack.
We don't have enough.
All right, boys and girls. Thanks for having me on, bud.
All right, sure thing, man. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.